All right, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to participate, even though I have a different journal allegiance than PPP. All right, so I'm going to carry on this discussion of increasing temperatures, and for those of you who were here or anywhere in Europe in July, I don't have to remind you that it's getting really hot. This was just a little over a month ago here, and you can see temperatures up in the 40s. It's getting hot globally as well, and so these are projected, the increase in temperature projected for the end of this century based on different models of different carbon emissions. And so this is, you might think of as the best case scenario if we get our emissions under control and maybe sequester a little bit of it, and this is more worst case control if we, situation with business as usual. But even with a lot of reduction in our carbon emissions, you can see that temperatures are going to increase by several degrees, and that increase is more exacerbated poleward. So it's getting hotter, but it's also getting hotter earlier. And so these two diagrams are based on those same two models, looking at the projected increase in the frost-free growing season length, again by the end of this century. And you can see that even the best case scenario, the growing season length will increase by a couple of weeks by the end of the century, or maybe even by a couple of months. This is the same elsewhere in the world. This is the United States, for those of you who don't recognize the map. But this is a map of Europe showing similar projected changes. This is now expressed differently in days per year, but the hotter squares are greater increases. So spring, warm temperatures are getting higher and warm temperatures are coming earlier, and plants and animals, of course, are responding to these changes. And phenological shifts have been among the most obvious and thoroughly documented biological responses to climate warming of the past 150 years. And by phenology, I mean the seasonal timing of life cycle events, and the life cycle event that I'm going to talk about is flowering. And we have just increasing, the evidence of changing phenology is just increasing dramatically, study after study. And the evidence comes from a variety of different sources, including historical records of flowering, such as the 1,300+ year record of cherries blooming in Japan. And we know that this is occurring quite a bit earlier than it has historically. Some really amazing data sets are being unearthed based on herbarium data. And these kinds of studies, the publication record is just skyrocketing of people who are collecting flowering dates from herbarium data. And this is just one example from many, many of these kinds of papers documenting changing flowering phenologies. This one comes from a study of plants in the central region of the United States. And it covers 141 species over a 100-year time interval. What's shown here is essentially phenological responsiveness. So over here are earlier flowering, here is later flowering, and the species are simply arranged in rank order from the earliest flowering to the latest flowering. And what these authors were so excited about is, look, 46% of these species are flowering earlier in warmer years over this 100-year interval. And that's the headline that you see on most of these studies that are coming out, regardless of what kind of data they're using. Wow, look, plants are flowering earlier when the year is warmer. But the thing that my colleague and co-author Krista Mulder and I are so fascinated by is that 54% of these taxa are not flowering earlier, right? In very warm years, they're not budging. They're either, flowering when they've historically flowered, or they're even flowering later. And even though that's not the headline of these studies, it's really interesting because it doesn't, how do you explain that, right? If it gets warm earlier, plants should flower earlier. And so really what I want to explore today is just this basic question. What explains such exceptions to the common association of advancing phenology with warming temperatures? Well, what do we actually know about phenology? What makes a plant flower? Well, unfortunately, we don't know all that much because most of what we know about cues for flowering comes from a few economically important species, Populus, some flowering fruit crop trees, and Arabidopsis. And I'm actually interested in perennial plants, so I'm not going to talk about Arabidopsis. So based on the rest of what we know temperature is really important determinant of flowering. Most perennials require some period of cold in order to be released from dormancy, so then they can respond to some period of warm in order to begin flowering. So temperature is in there, and day length too affects flowering, or is a signal for flowering in some species, but not all species, and it varies. And day length turns out to be actually a bigger determinant of end of season phenological events. Okay, but most of this research about flowering cues is correlative. It relates easily observable phenomena, such as the date of first flowering, to temperature indices, usually growing degree days. But the thing that we're measuring, anthesis, the opening of a flower, is really just a single brief phase within a really complex developmental trajectory that often begins 1 or more years previous to the thing we're looking at. For example, when this Magnolia stellata bursts into flower in the spring, each one of those flowers was initiated nearly a year previously. So the flower was initiated, underwent some amount of morphogenesis, and then overwintered in this partially developed state, protected there by those lovely fuzzy bud scales. And this is a process known as preformation. That is the initiation of leaf and flower primordia 1 or more growing seasons before maturation and function. And this process, this developmental process of preformation, is really characteristic of temperate trees, shrubs, and herbaceous perennials, and it's ubiquitous for high elevation and high latitude species. And so here I've illustrated this 2-year trajectory, developmental trajectory of preformation. So briefly, starting here in winter with a dormant plant, dormant buds, we have this period of chilling. Plants are released from dormancy. Some period of warm temperatures maybe induces growth. The meristems resume their activity. There's a transition from vegetative to reproductive development. Floral organs are initiated. They undergo morphogenesis. There's other developmental events, including meiosis and gametophyte development and gamete formation. And then somewhere in this process, the flower stops developing and enters just a state that I'm going to refer to as bud set, where it's not developing anymore. The plant and the bud become dormant, spend the winter that way. Dormancy is released, growth resumes, the flower completes its development and reaches anthesis here in the spring. But we know really very little about this process, right? We don't know really when meristems begin growing again in the spring. We don't know when bud set occurs. We don't really know even when they begin growing again in the spring of their second year. And we really don't know what determines the rate that they progress through all of these different developmental stages. And this is nearly 2 years, and it wouldn't be surprising if temperature can affect any one of those processes. But it's really, this is all going on inside a little bud that's all closed up by these protective bud scales and is really, really hard to study. And so we really don't know how temperature might affect the onset of development, the rate of development, when it turns off again, when it turns on again. And so I'm going to keep telling you what we don't know. And so my colleague Chris and I have come up with some conceptual models to really explore how temperature might affect these processes, and specifically to try to explain what might result in delayed flowering in particularly warm years or early springs. And I'm going to use this more simple developmental diagram to illustrate our conceptual models. So this is this 2-year period, year 1, year 2, starting when the plants emerge from dormancy, progress through a series of developmental stages. This is bud set, so the plant stops developing for the winter, dormancy, emergence from dormancy in the second year, then the flower completes its development and undergoes anthesis here in the second year. And so this red line will show you when anthesis is occurring in our control or our normal developmental trajectory. So I'm just going to go through these conceptual models. So what would happen if warm temperatures actually induced early bud set and dormancy? And this is consistent with what we do know from the physiological literature on populus and other trees, where experimental warming during the shorter day lengths of the late summer can actually induce early dormancy. And so what I've shown here now is that rather than going through stage 4, bud set and dormancy occur early here, leaving flowers, when they emerge from dormancy in year 2, to have more stages of development to complete before they finally reach anthesis at a delayed time. Okay, so the next model has 2 kind of versions to it, and depends on the observation that flowers within inflorescences or with individual flowers on an individual plant can be in very different stages of development at the same time. And so this is actually a developing inflorescence. These are young flower buds. They're initiated sequentially, starting from the base to the tip. And so these first initiated flowers will be at more advanced stages of development, when later initiated flowers at the tip will be in earlier stages of development. And this can be variable among plants as well. And so what we're supposing then is that warm temperatures might induce these more well-developed flowers to reach anthesis in the fall, in the year that they are initiated, leaving these less well-developed floral primordia to finish their development in the succeeding year, and anthesis will be later than usual. Okay, and so there's really 2 ways that warm temperatures might result in flowering in the same year. And again, this depends on flowers being in different developmental stages on the same plant. And so here's the top row on both of these diagrams are the most advanced flowers, and the bottom row are the least well advanced flowers. And so the first way that the most advanced flowers might be induced to flower in the current year might be if warm temperatures actually delay bud set. And so up here, these well-developed flowers don't get that signal to go into bud set, and they actually, flowers go into anthesis in that year, the same year they were initiated, leaving these less well-developed flowers to undergo dormancy and complete more stages of development in the following spring with a delay in anthesis. Warm temperatures, alternatively, warm temperatures might actually accelerate the rate of development, so that these more advanced flowers are able to complete development before they get this cue to stop developing and go into dormancy or bud set. And so you'll get some anthesis here in the fall, again with these less well-developed flowers completing their development in the second year with delayed flowering. And these 2 models are consistent with sort of anecdotal but really common reports of sporadic fall flowering in a lot of different species. So it's in sort of the gray literature, botanical garden literature, makes the New York Times reports, but hasn't really been, no data have been published on it, or very little. Okay, and then finally, warm temperatures might delay the initiation of reproductive development, such that flowers might delay initiation. And so here, plants may emerge from dormancy at the correct time, but they don't begin to initiate floral organs until later in the season, so they become dormant in these earlier stages and have more stages of development to complete in the spring. And this might be particularly common in plants that have terminal inflorescences. And so here's a shoot with this bud here in which flowers and leaves are preforming. And so you can see here, if the inflorescence is terminal, that meristem has to initiate a series of leaf primordia, which are these little blue arcs in my illustration here, before it can begin to initiate flowers. Well, if you imagine that warm temperatures actually prolong vegetative growth, then that meristem may produce many more leaf primordia before it makes that transition to reproductive development, and that development is going to be delayed, as I illustrated here. Okay, so I've presented you these several models, that are all consistent with observation of delayed flowering. And again, I want to remind you, this is usually what we're looking at, and we're trying to correlate this with environmental conditions, usually that we're measuring here in the same year. But what I've just shown you is that the same data point of delayed flowering can occur by many, many different developmental mechanisms, all producing that same result. And so really what we need to do is study development, which is what my colleague and Krista and I are doing. And we're also working up in the Boreal Forest, which now you already know why it's really important to study the Boreal Forest. And also want to just add that it's the world's largest biome. So not only is it storing a lot of carbon, it's going to have a pretty important effect on the globe as the climate changes. So we're working up here in Alaska, in the central part of Alaska around Fairbanks. This is interior Alaska, where the average temperature is already up by 1.4 degrees, and the growing season is already up by a whopping 45%. And so we're using little ITEX-style growth chambers to manipulate temperature around shrubs in the Boreal Forest. And we're using a modest temperature increase, realistic across the more current time span. And yeah, so we're using these experimental little growth chambers to manipulate the plants. This is my colleague Krista and my graduate student Eileen setting up the growth chambers in early May, just as the snow's melted off and the ground is still frozen. We're working in black spruce forests, birch forests, and I'm not going to go through, I'm just going to give you a hint of results from this species, Vaccinium vitis-idea, which I'll just make a people relationship here in that this has great cultural importance for the native Alaskans and is an important food source for many of the tribes. Okay, so we've done this experimental warming over 2 years. And so I just want to give you a hint of some of the phenological data. And so this is phenological data recorded in 2018. And this is just essentially average flowering. So, so advanced early flowering is up, delayed flowering is down. And so this is the average phenological score for our control plots that weren't warmed. So look first at this bar. These are plots that were warmed in 2018, and we're looking at their phenology in 2018. And you can see that plants are warmed in 2018, they flower earlier in 2018. But here's plants that were warmed in 2017 and then left alone. So they were in ambient temperature at 2018. And their flowering is slightly but significantly delayed relative to the control. So the temperature during that year of preformation is really affecting their development significantly. And so now we're in the process of busily dissecting those meristems to try and figure out what process is being affected here and what process is being affected here. I also want to just show you one last bit of data to suggest that there is a temperature threshold effect. So this again is phenology in 2018. This is early, that's late. So this is 2018. This is temperature in 2017. These are control. So there is a range of temperatures across our different plots. And you can see that within the temperature range of these controls, warmer temperatures is associated with earlier flowering. But with just that average 2 degree increase generated by our growth chambers, you can see that warmer plots have significantly delayed flowering. So there's some sort of threshold there going on. And so, again, we're in the middle of these developmental studies to try and understand the effects of temperature in this part of development with the aim that we'll more generally be able to understand the diversity of plant responses to the increasing temperatures that we're seeing across the globe. And thank you, and I know I went over.